General Hospital spoiler reveal that the shock emerging in Port Charles did not begin with a confrontation or a public announcement. It began as something far quieter, far more insidious, a small ripple that would soon swell into a storm powerful enough to bend the fate of an entire family. It started the moment Scout Quartermain discovered a nondescript envelope lying alone at the edge of her bedroom door, a thin sliver of paper that seemed so harmless in appearance, yet carried a presence strong enough to make her heart thud without reason. Life with Drew Kane had already become a labyrinth of confusion, fear, pressure, and emotional distortion, and Scout had grown used to the suffocating heaviness that filled the house ever since his grudges and obsessions took root. Every room felt unstable, every day unpredictable, and the absence of her mother had become an unspoken wound that never closed, a pain she carried quietly even when she did not fully understand it. But the letter changed everything the moment she touched it. Something in the weight of the envelope, the faint scent of familiarity, the soft scrape of the paper against her fingertips awakened a memory buried deep within her, a memory of safety, warmth, and love, feelings she had nearly forgotten she once had. She slipped into her room, locked the door, and opened the envelope slowly, carefully, almost reverently, as if she sensed the contents could shatter the fragile world she lived in. The handwriting on the folded page made her breath catch, not because it was remarkable, but because it was unmistakable. She had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, on school notes tucked into lunch bags, on little reminders taped to mirrors in a life that now felt like a distant dream. It was her mother's handwriting, and the realization hit her with a force that stole the air from her lungs. The message was short, but every word was a blade of revelation carving through her heart. It declared that Sam McCall was alive, watching from a place Scout did not know, unable to return yet, but close enough to reach out. Scout's chest tightened as she read, her pulse racing with a mix of joy, disbelief, fear, and an emotional ache so deep that she pressed the letter to her chest as if it might vanish if she let go. Sam warned her not to tell Drew, a warning that intensified the secret into something almost sacred, something dangerous but empowering. Something that made Scout feel seen for the first time in months. She knew the warning was necessary because Drew had become increasingly controlling, his resentment toward Jason spilling over into every aspect of life, including his harsh restrictions on Scout's communication with Danny. Scout often felt like she lived in a maze designed not to protect her, but to keep her small, obedient, and isolated. Now, with her mother's letter tucked beneath her pillow, she felt the first hint of resistance forming in her spirit, a quiet resolve that rose inside her like a new heartbeat. What Scout could not know was that the letter was not merely a message of love. It was Sam's desperate attempt to anchor herself back into her daughter's world. After years entangled in the shadows of Faison's final experiment, a disappearance that had broken Sam's body, tested her sanity, and forced her to survive on nothing but determination to return. Sam had endured captivity, manipulation, and the kind of isolation that drives most people into madness, but through it all, she remained tethered to her children, clinging to the belief that she would one day return to protect them. When she finally escaped and resurfaced in the outskirts of Port Charles, she knew she could not reveal herself yet. Too many threats still lurked in the city, too many shifting alliances, too many dangerous entanglements involving Willow's hidden crime and Drew's unraveling state of mind. Sam's greatest fear was not her own safety, but the possibility that Scout had been reshaped by Drew's bitterness, indoctrinated into his vendettas, or emotionally harmed by his tightening control. That fear drove Sam to send the anonymous letter, choosing secrecy over immediate reunion because she could not risk losing Scout again. As Scout read the letter each night, hope took root inside her, transforming the sadness she carried into something powerful and sustaining. She began observing Drew differently, not with the passive obedience he expected, but with a quiet awareness that irritated him in ways he could not explain. He sensed that something in Scout had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable, and mistook it as defiance rather than the awakening of her spirit. Drew responded, as he always did, by tightening his rules, making demands, raising his voice, and trying to regain control of what he had already lost. Each attempt only pushed Scout further away emotionally, the letter acting as both shield and anchor whenever Drew's anger surged too close. Meanwhile, Alexis experienced her own unease, a sensation she could not define, as if some invisible part of her maternal intuition had begun to stir, whispering to her that Sam's story was far from finished. Her anxiety grew as she watched Drew's hostility intensify, and saw Scout shrinking under the weight of his expectations. Alexis had always felt responsible for protecting her grandchildren, but with Sam gone, the responsibility became a moral burden she carried alone, unaware that Sam herself was watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to reclaim the life stolen from her. The ripple created by the letter stretched beyond Alexis, passing through Sunny's instincts, brushing against Jason's subconscious guilt, and even unsettling Willow as her own hidden crime continued to corrode any illusion of peace she tried to maintain. The shock of Sam's survival did not need to be publicly revealed for Port Charles to feel the tremor. Her presence alone, even in secrecy, created a tension that clung to the air like an approaching storm. Scout read the letter over and over, memorizing each curve of Sam's handwriting until she could see it even with her eyes closed, whispering the words under her breath as if reciting a spell designed to protect her from the chaos of her father's home. Sam's promise that she was coming back stayed with Scout like a pulse beneath her skin, a reminder of hope she could not share with anyone. And as days passed, the secret grew heavier, yet it strengthened her resolve, shaping her into someone braver than she ever thought she could be. The anonymous letter became the silent rupture that no one else saw, a hidden warning that the balance of power around Scout was shifting. Sam's return, once considered impossible, now hovered in the air like an echo that refused to fade, and everyone connected to Scout willingly or not would soon feel the impact of the truth she held. Because Sam was not simply alive, she was watching, waiting, and preparing to re-enter a world that had moved on without her, a world that would be forced to face the consequences of her resurrection. Scout kept the letter hidden, but its presence reshaped everything within her, becoming the first sign of a larger, darker shock rising through Port Charles. And when Sam finally stepped from the shadows, the fragile reality Drew had built would collapse piece by piece, leaving nothing untouched and no one unscarred. The transformation taking shape in Port Charles had begun as a whisper, a subtle shift beneath the emotional landscape of the town, but it quickly grew into an unstoppable force that seeped into every corner of Scout Quartermain's life, twisting her days into something dark, heavy, and suffocating. What had once been a fragile attempt at normalcy under Drew Kane's roof had deteriorated into a psychological battleground where Scout tiptoed through her own home, as if navigating a minefield, never knowing which step would set off the next explosion of anger or control. Drew's presence, once protective, had transformed into something volatile, unpredictable, and deeply frightening. His voice no longer carried guidance, but commands. His expectations no longer reflected care, but domination. The windows seemed to let in less light, the walls felt tighter, and the spaces Scout once used for comfort now echoed with tension, so thick she could barely breathe through it. She had become a ghost inside her own childhood, a child shaped by silence, by fear, by hyper-awareness, constantly monitoring Drew's mood so she could anticipate the next wave of force that would come crashing down upon her without warning. And at the center of this suffocating storm, a new force began to rise. Sam McCall, alive, watching, and about to reclaim the daughter she had fought years to survive for. Sam's return was not simply a miracle or a twist crafted for shock value. It was the inevitable result of a mother's refusal to remain dead. When her child was spiraling into danger, Sam had endured captivity, isolation, psychological torment, and the grotesque legacy of Faison's final project. Surviving on nothing but willpower and the memory of her children, she carried scars the world could not see, but beneath them lived a fire burning hotter than the fear that once kept her hidden in the shadows of Port Charles. The moment she learned what Scout had been subjected to under Drew's increasingly unhinged rule, that fire evolved into something sharper, more controlled, almost surgical in its precision. Sam no longer returned as the woman she was, she returned as a reckoning. She began gathering evidence quietly, observing the patterns of Drew's behavior, watching how Scout's joy had evaporated into a haunting emptiness, how the brightness in her eyes had dimmed under the weight of emotional pressure and relentless correction. Sam recognized these symptoms not as childish rebellion, but as trauma, as survival mechanisms developed by a child forced to adapt to an environment unsafe for her emotional well-being. Each detail Sam uncovered became a thread in the larger case she was building, a case that would not simply argue for custody, but expose Drew's deterioration as a parent and reveal the depth of the psychological damage he was inflicting. And as Sam prepared to reveal herself and fight for custody, the energy around Port Charles shifted into something colder, heavier, almost foreboding. The town didn't yet know what was rising, but it could sense the approaching storm through the sudden tension in Alexis Davis's voice, the nervousness in Willow's eyes each time Drew's name was mentioned, the restless movements of Danny Morgan as though some invisible thread was pulling him toward a truth he couldn't name. Even Sonny felt it, a subtle disturbance echoing through his instincts, a stirring that told him something long buried was resurfacing. At the center of this shift stood Drew, oblivious to the truth forming around him, spiraling deeper into his delusion of control as he clung to Scout with increasing desperation. In his mind, he was protecting her, shaping her, strengthening her, but in reality, he was breaking her. Every time he snapped at her for small mistakes, every time he dismissed her fear as weakness, every time he forced his will upon her, he was carving wounds into her emotional landscape that would take years to heal. His need to dominate her world grew into an obsession that blinded him to the quiet suffering of the child before him. And that obsession became the fuel for the larger story, beginning to consume all of Port Charles. For Scout, each day became a study in survival. She learned which footsteps meant anger, which meant exhaustion, which meant danger. She learned to fold her shoulders inward, to make herself smaller, to hide her tears so they wouldn't be interpreted as disobedience. But beneath all this fear lived something newly awakened, the secret Sam had given her, the knowledge that her mother was alive and coming for her. This secret became Scout's anchor, the only warmth in a home rapidly turning into a nightmare, the only sense of hope she had left. And hope is a powerful thing, even when held by a frightened child. It allowed Scout to emotionally detach from Drew's outbursts, to build a mental wall that protected her from the worst of his behavior. But it also intensified Drew's paranoia as he sensed her slipping away from his emotional grasp. The more Scout's will strengthened, the more Drew tightened his fist around her life. This escalating pattern grew into a dangerous psychological dance, one Sam could see from afar, and one she would not allow to continue. As Sam prepared her return quietly, strategically, and with a mother's fury simmering beneath the surface, the great obsession began to take shape. It was no longer just Drew's obsession with control. It became the town's obsession with the truth. Alexis's obsession with protecting Scout from emotional ruin. Willow's obsession with hiding her own guilt while watching Drew crumble. Jason's subconscious obsession with the feeling that something from his past was calling to him. And Scout's obsession with the promise that her mother would save her. This collective pressure formed a storm cloud thick and heavy over Port Charles, each emotion feeding into the next until the entire town carried a sense of dread. Without knowing why, Sam's return was not simply a plot twist, it was the epicenter of a psychological earthquake, one that would rip apart the fragile structures Drew had built and expose the darkness festering beneath. The custody battle that was coming would not be a simple legal clash. It would be an emotional war where every secret, every lie, every buried trauma would claw its way to the surface. Scout's whispered fear, Drew's tightening rage, Sam's rising determination, and the town's unspoken awareness would merge into one monstrous tension. A new obsession consuming the landscape of General Hospital. And in the heart of that growing nightmare, one truth became undeniable. Sam was not just coming back to reclaim Scout. She was coming back to reclaim justice, to reclaim her place in a world that had shattered without her, and to confront the nightmare Drew had become before he destroyed their daughter entirely. The great obsession had begun, unstoppable and terrifying, and it would not end until the final truth was dragged screaming into the light. The shockwave that tore through Port Charles began the instant Sam McCall, no longer hidden, no longer silenced, stepped forward with a revelation dangerous enough to shatter not only Drew Kane's world, but the entire foundation of the custody battle that had begun suffocating Scout Quartermain's fragile spirit. In a single decisive moment, Sam announced what she had carried like a buried flame inside her chest. Scout was not Drew's biological daughter, had never been tied to him by blood, and the years of spiraling control, intimidation, and emotional suffocation Drew had inflicted were not the acts of a misguided father. They were the acts of a man who had assumed a role that was never his to claim. The truth ignited through Port Charles like gasoline catching fire, unraveling the illusion Drew had built around his identity and exposing how hollow and desperate his grasp on Scout truly was. Every outburst, every restriction, every cruel twist of control suddenly transformed into something darker. Because now they were not merely harmful, they were illegitimate. They were the actions of someone who had no genetic claim to the child. He had been molding into a reflection of his trauma and paranoia. And while Drew reeled in a psychological collapse that deepened with every passing hour, Alexis Davis rose into the center of the storm with a force that jolted the entire legal system. Alexis had always been powerful, but grief, rage, and maternal instinct collided inside her to create something far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. She saw now with terrifying clarity that Scout's suffering had been far worse than she feared. That Drew's tightening grasp had pushed the child into a constant war for emotional survival, and that Sam's long absence had left a vacuum Drew had filled with dominance. But with Sam's return came a truth that rewrote the battlefield, shifting the power from Drew's hands into the fierce, uncompromising grip of the Davis women. Alexis moved with precision, channeling every ounce of legal skill, personal fury, and moral conviction she possessed into an aggressive custody assault that blindsided the courthouse and sent shockwaves through the Quartermain and Corinthos circles. She no longer approached the situation as a grandmother trying to intervene. She approached it as a warrior who had watched her daughter be taken, her granddaughter be shaped into fear, and her entire family be dragged through torment. The document she filed read as a demolition of Drew's credibility, exposing emotional instability, a dangerous pattern of coercion, and now the absence of biological standing. Alexis tore apart every legal argument Drew had prepared, dismantling them with relentless efficiency. She argued that Scout's safety had been compromised, that her emotional state had deteriorated, and that Drew's behavior was no longer just concerning, it was an imminent threat to the child's psychological development. She exposed how he had weaponized his grudges, used Danny as leverage, and twisted Scout's life into a maze of fear from which she desperately needed escape. As Alexis advanced, Drew retreated into an increasingly frantic state, unable to process the destruction of the identity he had clung to. Losing biological connection to Scout ripped the core out of him, shattering the last thread of stability he thought he had. His obsession with control, once dangerous, now began mutating into something unhinged. And while Drew spiraled, Sam's return grew hotter, louder, and more disruptive with every passing day. She had not simply returned from the dead, she returned with a mission, a reclamation of the bloodline she had nearly lost, and a fury sharpened by years of isolation and suffering. Watching Scout shrink under Drew's shadow had broken something inside Sam that could not be repaired, and all the grief she carried transformed into a blazing clarity. Scout was hers, her responsibility, her child to protect, and no force in Port Charles, not Drew, not Willow, not the legal system, would stand in her way again. Sam moved like a storm gathering heat, reshaping every room she entered with the force of her presence. Her return was not calm or gentle, it was electric, volatile, the kind of moment that made the entire town feel as though history was bending. Her story wasn't a resurrection, it was a reckoning, and the Davis family began to shift around her, gathering strength in a way that felt almost ancestral. Alexis and Sam, once fractured, once separated by choices and heartbreak, now aligned with a shared purpose so powerful it radiated through their every action. The Davis family had always been underestimated, overshadowed by louder legacies in Port Charles, but now they rose with terrifying unity, transforming into a matriarchal force that silenced even their strongest opponents. Every time Alexis stepped into the courthouse, she carried Sam's rage with her. Every time Sam stepped into the world, she carried Alexis's power behind her. And with every move they made, the The truth about Scout's future began crystallizing. She would no longer be trapped under Drew's emotional tyranny. She would be reclaimed by the family that truly belonged to her. Even the town began to feel the shift, whispering about the Davis resurgence, about Sam's resurrection, about the explosive combination of Alexis's legal brutality and Sam's emotional fire. It became clear to everyone watching that this custody battle was not simply a story of parental rights, it was the rebirth of a dynasty, shaped not by wealth or intimidation, but by pain, survival, and the unstoppable force of 3 generations of Davis women rising in sync. And behind this rise pulsed a deeper, darker undercurrent, the truth that Scout's paternity revelation was only the first tier. In the fabric of Drew's life, more truths were coming, more consequences, more destruction. And Sam, now fully alive in every sense of the word, walked directly into the fire with her head high, prepared to burn down every barrier between her and the daughter she had nearly died trying to protect. The Davis family did not simply return, they ignited. They expanded. They evolved into a storm powerful enough to reshape Port Charles itself. And as the truth continued to spread, shocking every household and unsettling every alliance, one reality grew undeniable. The rise of the Davis women had only just begun, and the fight for Scout was the spark that would transform them into the most unstoppable force the town had seen in years.